Ladies and gentlemen, I am Sid Alpha, and it's been quite a while since we've had a good old-fashioned first impressions video, and I was feeling a longing to take a step back from all the controversies and crap that has been infesting the industry lately, and just spend some time playing a game and really giving it a good once-over, and I'm glad that I did. Now, full disclosure, as you'll see in the description of the video down below, this was obtained via review copy. I know that doesn't matter much to most people, but when I do get review code, I think it only appropriate to point out that I did not pay for the game, I did receive it for free. But now that we got that out of the way, this game is called Ancient Frontier, and it is a turn-based strategy game by Fairweather Studios that was released almost a month ago on September 21st. I was actually given code for this before the game was released, and I regret not having an opportunity to take a look at it until just within the last few days. The reason being is that I actually really enjoy this game, but before I show you why, let's take a quick look at the options menu. Now, for those of you that don't know, I always like to look at the options menu because it's usually a pretty clear indication of how the game as a whole is going to be. The level and attention to detail put into the options menu shows whether thought and effort were invested, and looking at this, I think we're off to a pretty good start. It has all of your standard screen resolutions along with overall graphics levels, anti-aliasing, anisotropic filtering, and all the different audio aspects are separated out into their individual sliders, as well as having some basic UI elements as well. I also like that while there aren't a ton of options here, they still didn't go overboard and separate everything out into their own individual windows. This keeps everything compact and neat while still providing the functionality that we need. And about the only thing that I do note is missing here is, of course, color deficiency options, which I always keep an eye out for in my reviews. I'm not colorblind and I don't need them personally, but I think it's always a good idea to give game developers props when they include that level of thoughtfulness. And now that we have that out of the way, welcome to Ancient Frontier. As I said, this is a turn-based strategy game that actually seems to borrow some elements from XCOM and other similar style strategy games. This game has your fleet engage in its various missions on a hexagonal-style map and has you commanding a small but decent variety of ships. And we'll get into the game's mechanics and functionality in a moment, but I did want to acknowledge that this game does in fact have a story mode campaign. It actually has two different campaigns. The first is the Alliance campaign, which follows the main character Blake. The second campaign, which is the one I chose for my playthrough, is the Federation campaign, which follows Lieutenant Ethan and his Navy cohorts. Both of these groups, along with the pirate faction, do have their own history and backstory within this universe, and the developers included a lore tab that, while not having a great deal of information, provides enough of a backstory so that you can get a pretty good feel for the different factions and what they're all about. Limited to 3 pages per faction, it won't take you long to read, and as far as primers go, it's really pretty decent. And the story itself, from what I've seen in my 4 hours of gameplay, is also pretty decent. It's not exceptional by any means, but there's definitely enough there to keep the player engaged and interested. Although I do have to warn you that the voice actor for Lieutenant Ethan especially, it doesn't feel like he's done a particularly great job, and there have been moments where I feel like he really wasn't getting the tone of the dialogue in that particular instance. But laying that aside, the fact that it is voice acted at all is a pleasant surprise for me. Now, I've seen quite a lot of games that merely just plastered up some character icons and lines of text and called it good enough. That they opted to include voice acting at all was an additional expense and yet another bit of attention to detail that shows to me that the developers cared enough about their game to not go cutting any corners anywhere. Now, next up, I wanted to take a look at the core game itself. Now, the game, as I said, does follow a story mission campaign, which, while it doesn't give you branching dialogue trees, which, let's be honest, these types of games traditionally don't have expansive dialogues like one might expect with a full-blown RPG, but it does give you some, which, while allowing you a little bit of player choice and allows you some agency in regards to certain decisions. Most of those decisions focus directly on the mission objectives within the game, such as choosing to allow civilian ships to live and only eliminate a convoy's escort that's hauling contraband, allowing the contraband to be confiscated but sparing some lives in the process. Or you could choose to go the other route and just decide not to risk it and choose to destroy the entire convoy. And depending on your choice, you have different objectives in the following mission. Now, the game does have multiple mechanics that we'll have to go through, and while none of them are overly complicated, they are worth mentioning. Now here we have our fleet tab, and as you can see, I do have a small variety of ships. These, of course, serve their own function within the fleet and can be used to complement each other quite well. First, we have Lieutenant Ethan's ship, the Fury. It is an Enforcer frigate that, yes, if this were Warhammer 40k, would of course move much faster than other Enforcer frigates by simple virtue of it being red. And these ships are small support class capital ships that are equally good against other capital ships or for taking out enemy fighters. And you'll note on the right hand side of the screen that these ships have a variety of abilities. Some of them, like the ion cannon and the twin pulse laser turrets, are simply the ship's complement of weaponry, but there are some additional abilities here too that you will absolutely need to take advantage of in order to survive some missions. The first here is the Charge Shield ability, which boosts your ship's shields back up to full strength and also provides a 10% critical defense for 2 turns, which decreases the chance of an opponent getting a critical strike on your ship. This has a 2-turn cooldown, and you only have 3 uses per engagement, so it's worth bearing in mind as you're engaged in combat that you do need to plan out for eventualities such as that. Then you also have other abilities such as the Targeting Computer, which grants you a 25% chance to hit increase, and also increases your chance of landing a critical hit an additional 10%. Now, those are pretty standard fare, and most of your ships have those abilities, but you can unlock other abilities through the Research tab that we'll talk about next. Now in here we also have the Manta Heavy Fighter, which, as you can see by virtue of my having more of these than any other ship type, are my favorite ship class so far. Maneuverable and capable of decent damage, I've researched upgrades for these ships far more than any of the others, mostly because of their level of damage, their cost, and their relatively low requirement to be able to deploy large numbers of them at any given time. And we also have the Saber, which is a lighter scout vessel possessing of lighter weapons but can travel much further, which is an advantage on maps where you have a lot of resources to pick up or are forced to explore a certain number of hexes within a specific period of time. Then we have ships like the Wyvern Sentinel, which is designed as an anti-fighter escort ship, the Predator Corvette, which is a heavily armed but lightly armored hunter-killer ship, and then we have the Puritan Destroyer, which is a slow-moving ship that is capable of delivering a good amount of punishment to either the capital ships or other fighter units. And that's just on the Federation side. The Alliance has their own unique vessels that perform similar functions, but for the sake of this being a first impression review, I decided to focus just on one campaign as opposed to both. Now, in addition to the ships themselves, the game does include an equipment system that will allow you to customize your ships, allowing for some to have increased shields, maneuverability, or damage, to name but a few. And as you progress through the game, you can pick up some fairly powerful upgrades in addition to those that are available in the shop. Each of these can have a stated detriment to another system or stat, and they each tend to increase the cost to deploy that particular craft in engagements. Now, all of these factors are controlled by your 3 resources that you see at the top of your screen. The first is the Hydrium, which is used to purchase and maintain your craft as well as being a primary resource for buying and selling goods. The second is Proto-Energy, which is the resource that you use to be able to deploy ships or colonies, and lastly there is Data, which is used to research and unlock abilities. And that brings me to the research area. It's all pretty straightforward here, and the research trees are not expansive, and what is there does make decent sense. As I've told you, I've already upgraded the crap out of my Manta fighters, as so far they are my favorite ship type in the game. Although that will most likely come back to bite me in the ass as I've been neglecting upgrades in my other ship types. Now, I think that as far as skill trees and unlockable progression goes, they did a good job here. They've covered the basics well enough and didn't tack on a bunch of extra garbage. They've also kept the UI clean and intuitive, as well as providing functional descriptions for each upgrade. And now that we've covered that, we'll direct ourselves to the Missions tab, and this I again found to be very intuitive and easy to understand. You have your story missions at the top, but you also have these optional deployments. Now, the first category of optional deployment is the bounty missions, where you undertake missions to gain some additional resources as well as experience, and if you want to take something a bit lower risk, you can take simulator missions, which grant you XP, but they neither earn you additional resources nor cost you any additional resources either. And the developers kept their eye towards balance here too, as with too many side missions, one might be able to over-tech or over-equip and steamroll the campaign. And they included an extremely simple, yet very effective method of controlling that by simply limiting the number of optional deployments you can take in between story missions. I thought that was a good solution and not one that you typically see introduced in these type of games. Actually, optional side missions themselves aren't seen too often in indie games of this type to begin with, and their inclusion is generally pretty well done here, and I didn't find any particular reason to complain. As for the combat itself, well, as I said, this was very similar in style to what you would see with XCOM, even going so far as to include the partial or full cover mechanics that you see with games of this type. It is turn-based, and while you don't necessarily have to think very much during the early missions, the game does have a good progression that will slowly get you more comfortable with its mechanics and introduce greater and greater difficulty in a way that feels very natural. I haven't seen any difficulty spikes quite yet, and the game itself keeps to a very even pace, each combat being unique in its own right, and to be honest, I went into this game expecting far worse than what I got, and the fact that I was able to be pleasantly surprised shows all by itself that these developers have managed to put together a game with some quality. The graphics are on a level to what I would expect of a game of this price. Nothing truly substantial or groundbreaking in that regard, but again, I am seeing some attention to detail with this game, such as the pan-by video segments on the mission screen and the fact that they do include some cutscenes within the game that give it a polished feel as a whole. The game itself has been extremely stable from what I've seen of it, and as far as replayability is concerned, well, I've barely scratched the surface with this game at the 4.5 hours that I've played so far, and I've seen user reviews on Steam where people have already clocked in anywhere between 4 and, in the case of one person, over 150 hours. So, as far as bang for your buck is concerned, Ancient Frontier has you covered. It seems that most people are clocking in between 40 and 50 hours, so as far as that goes, I think we're pretty well off. But is it worth it? Well, I think it's safe to determine that everyone already knows the answer to that by now, given how little negative I've had to say about the game. Overall, I'm enjoying the hell out of it, and I plan on playing much more of it in the future. In fact, I'm anxious to get this review finished so I can get back to playing it. And to my mind, for $25, this game is well worth your money and your time. The game is solid, it's polished, and contains a ton of content. The developers themselves, as I said, have paid a great deal of attention to the detail within the game, and for their part, have been highly receptive to criticism on their forums and have been fantastic about working with their community to fix bugs, releasing patches regularly, and how they handle their community has been great so far, and seeing their responsiveness makes me all the more willing to recommend their game to anyone who is a fan of turn-based strategy like this. Now, if you are a fan of these games like I am, then Ancient Frontier is a fantastic game and well worth your checking out. But as always, please do let me know what you think down in the comments below. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am Sid Alpha, and I'll see you next time.